In a stretch of the Nile Valley that would soon be submerged by the construction of the Aswan High Dam, archaeologist Fred Wendorf made a discovery in 1964 that would reshape how researchers thought about human prehistory. Near the border between Egypt and Sudan, he uncovered a burial site containing 61 ancient skeletons. The site, named Jebel Sahaba, had been created by the Qadaan culture approximately 14,000 years ago. Because nearly every skeleton bore unmistakable signs of physical trauma, Wendorf and his team believed they had located the oldest battlefield ever found. But were these individuals genuinely the casualties of an organized battle? And could warfare in any meaningful sense have existed that far back in human history? More recently, researcher Isabelle Crèvecoeur and her colleagues returned to the Jebel Sahaba remains with fresh methods and reached a different conclusion. The dead, women, children, and men alike, showed a mixture of injuries that had healed during life and injuries sustained at the time of death. The bodies had also not been interred simultaneously. This pattern points not to a single mass engagement, but to a prolonged series of smaller violent events. Raids, ambushes, and targeted killings spread across an extended period. At least 2 skeletons show evidence of execution while already on the ground, an arrow driven through the jaw into the skull. One woman, approximately 30 years old, had 21 stone fragments from arrowheads embedded in her body, along with a healed forearm fracture consistent with deflecting a strike from a club, suggesting she had survived at least one violent encounter before the attack that killed her. Jebel Sahaba remains one of the earliest known physical records of organized violence between human groups. But whether it constitutes war depends entirely on how we define that word, and that question turns out to be more contested than one might expect. Archaeologist Andrew K. Shearer defines war as a collective effort involving conflict between distinct autonomous groups, encompassing not only physical injury, but also emotional and psychological damage sustained by those involved. Under this framework, war requires at minimum 2 separate groups in opposition, broad participation from within those groups, and harm inflicted on both body and mind. Most archaeologists broadly accept this definition. Military historians, however, tend to insist on an additional condition: organization. In their view, a violent incident only qualifies as war if combatants are directed by a leader, operate with some degree of coordinated formation, and pursue a recognizable tactical purpose. For the purposes of tracing war's origins, organization is a meaningful criterion to include. It distinguishes warfare from mere interpersonal violence, even when the scale remains small. Ambushes, sustained feuds, and limited skirmishes can all satisfy this condition if they involve structured coordination. The clashes recorded at Jebel Sahaba are large enough in scope to potentially meet the threshold. Whether they were sufficiently organized, however, remains unclear. This uncertainty feeds into a much older debate. Is war innate to human nature, or is it something people learn and construct? Winston Churchill famously wrote that the story of the human race is war, and that outside brief and precarious interludes, true peace had never existed. This view echoed Thomas Hobbes, who characterized life in primitive society as brutish, violent, and short. Many archaeologists historically leaned in the other direction, following Rousseau's vision of the peaceful, noble savage living in natural harmony, an image reinforced after World War II, when scholars were reluctant to project brutality onto the distant past. Weapons were reinterpreted as hunting tools or status symbols. Fortifications were explained as flood barriers. That assumption was forcefully challenged in 1996, when archaeologist Lawrence H. Keeley published War Before Civilization, arguing that prehistoric conflict was neither marginal nor accidental. For small hunter-gatherer bands of 20 to 30 people, even the loss of a few adults could threaten the entire group's survival. Primitive warfare, Keeley wrote, was total war fought with very limited means. Around 500,000 years ago, early humans had developed fire and purpose-built spears for hunting large prey. Weapons grew steadily more sophisticated over subsequent generations. Points and blades fashioned from bone and stone, increasingly complex cooperation among hunters. By the last ice age, spears, clubs, and thrown projectiles were the primary tools available for both hunting and, almost certainly, conflict. One of the earliest known cases of a weapon wound on a human skeleton comes from Shanidar Cave in present-day Iraq. Shanidar III, a Neanderthal dating to roughly 45 to 50,000 years ago, carries a chest injury almost certainly caused by a thrown spear. Because Neanderthal anatomy made throwing mechanically difficult, researchers concluded the spear had been launched by a modern human, a Homo sapiens. This interpretation drew the find into the long-standing debate over how modern humans came to replace Neanderthals across Eurasia. 2 competing theories address this question. The interbreeding theory holds that the 2 species coexisted and mixed genetically. The replacement theory argues that modern humans forcibly displaced Neanderthals, possibly through violence, a scenario that some have characterized as an early form of genocide. Yuval Noah Harari, in his widely read book *Sapiens*, suggests the genetic overlap between modern humans and Neanderthals is too limited to support widespread interbreeding, instead proposing that superior technology and social organization gave Homo sapiens a decisive competitive advantage. This likely produced group-level conflict without yet amounting to coordinated warfare. As the late Paleolithic progressed, weapons became more efficient and new long-range tools appeared, including the atlatl, a spear-throwing lever that dramatically extended a hunter's reach. The conditions for organized violence were taking shape, and the Neolithic period that followed would bring them to full expression. In 1983, a wine grower in the small German town of Talheim was digging in his garden when he struck human bone. Excavation revealed 34 skeletons, men, women, and children, most bearing fatal blows to the skull from stone axes. Isotope analysis showed the victims had come from at least 3 separate groups. Notably, the women from Talheim itself were absent from the pit, leading researchers to suspect the massacre was linked to the abduction of females. The scale and method, surprise, execution, burial in a common pit, were repeated at 2 other sites, Kilianstaden and Schletz, suggesting a pattern of organized violence across Central Europe around 5000 BC. These massacres are associated with the linear pottery culture, considered the oldest permanently settled culture in Central Europe, known primarily for their large communal longhouses. Their existence connects directly to a broader transformation in human life, the Neolithic Revolution, in which people shifted from hunting and gathering to farming and permanent settlement. This shift intensified competition in ways that mobile hunter-gatherer life had not. Surplus food created something worth stealing. Stored grain, livestock, and cultivated land became targets. Groups that had not settled raided those that had. According to historian Kaushik Roy, the struggle over resources became the most consistent driver of conflict across Eurasia throughout this period. To protect their holdings, settled communities began constructing defensive works, ditches, walls, fortified perimeters, marking a threshold in the history of human conflict. War was no longer merely reactive, it was being planned for. A cave painting from Morella la Vella in northeastern Spain, roughly 5,000 years old, depicts 4 archers advancing against 3 others. Some historians read this as the first known image of a double envelopment, a flanking maneuver still recognized in military doctrine today. Other paintings from the same period show archers marching in column, behind a leader, identifiable by a distinctive headdress, and at least one depicts the execution of a captive on the ground. Military historian Arthur Farrell interprets these images as evidence of the basic components of tactical thinking: hierarchy, column, and line. These structures almost certainly derived from cooperative hunting techniques, organized drives in which groups directed animals toward natural traps, later transferred to conflict between humans. 4 weapons became widespread during the Epipaleolithic and Neolithic periods: the bow, the sling, the dagger, and the mace. Of these, the bow was the most transformative. A well-thrown spear was effective to perhaps 25 meters. A spear thrower extended that to roughly 100. But even a basic bow could project an arrow over 150 meters, required less physical size and strength to operate, and allowed a fighter to carry and fire multiple projectiles in rapid succession. In the Near East, the sling was similarly dominant, requiring years of training, but capable of lethal accuracy at up to 180 meters. The consequences of these developments may be visible in human genetics. A 2018 study by Stanford University researchers proposed that a documented drop in male genetic diversity, occurring roughly 7,000 to 5,000 years ago, known as the Y chromosome bottleneck, resulted from patrilineal clans repeatedly destroying one another's male lineages over generations. The surviving genetic pool reflected not a physical reduction in male population, but the dominance of a small number of victorious bloodlines. Arthur Farrell has suggested that this period saw a burst of organized warfare as significant in its effects as the campaigns of Alexander the Great or the spread of Islam. Fortifications from this era make the point concretely. Jericho's walls, built around 8000 BC, were 3 meters thick, 4 meters high, and anchored by a 10-meter stone tower enclosing a settlement of several thousand people. At Catalhoyuk, the outermost ring of houses was built as a continuous barrier with no ground-level entrances. Access was only by rooftop ladder, creating a layered defensive system that trapped intruders between walls while defenders fired from above. Otzi the Iceman, discovered in the Tyrolean Alps in 1991 and dating to approximately 3250 BC, offers a final, human-scale summary of this era. An arrow embedded in his shoulder blade and wounds on his hands suggest he died in, or shortly after, a violent confrontation. He may be the most recognized individual victim of prehistoric warfare, and he stands as a reminder that behind every settlement wall and every shift in human genetics, there were actual people navigating a world in which organized violence had become a permanent condition of life.